That was to get all the sound synced with all the mics. Thank you everyone so much for coming. It's so wonderful to see everyone here. Welcome to Fighting for Free Future's first event. The theme of today's event is 1 month until the budget, why the UK is in such a bad state and how we can fix it. As many of you know, we launched last month under our chairman, the Right Honourable Steve Baker. And with the nightmare before Christmas budget coming up, feels like today's event is very, very apt to speak about just why the UK is in such a bad state and what can be done to fix it. We have some of the UK's most eminent speakers here today, and we're going to be speaking about, some of the core missions of Fighting for a Free Future: lower taxes, a smaller state, prosperity, all the reasons that, many of us here work in politics, many of us here work in Westminster, and many of us want to use to make the UK a better place, make the people of the UK more prosperous. Thank you to all of our donors for your support. Today would not be possible without you, and we are so excited to hold more events in the future and to build on the success of today and everything we've done so far. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. We'll be opening with Robert Colvile from the CPS, who'll be speaking about the fact that there is no money left. Secondly, we'll have Maxwell Marlow from the ASI speaking about planning and housing reform. After that, we'll be having our keynote speech from Lord Moynihan on the return to growth, followed by a panel which will be chaired by our chairman, Steve Baker, which will host Kristen Nemowitz from the IEA, John O'Connell from the TPA, Fred de Fossard from the Prosperity Institute, and Harry Wilkinson from GWPF, as well as Lord Moynihan joining the panel. Now, we have a lot of wonderful speakers to get to, a lot of wonderful topics to talk about, and a lot of timings to keep to. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Robert Colvile.
Thank you. I'll just put my phone in front of me so I stick to my 10 minutes. So I've been asked, before John does the sort of hopey, changey optimism stuff, I've been asked to talk about how to really get everyone in the mood on a wet, not so wet, but on a sort of wintry Tuesday morning with just how screwed we are. And the reason we are screwed, of course, is due to Brexit. Steve, John, Bernard, all of you, shame on you. Sorry. No, in fact, it's not actually due to Brexit. No, the argument I would make is that the reason we are screwed, and we are screwed, is because politicians haven't been honest, and politicians haven't felt able to be honest. And that's true in a sort of narrow sense and a broad sense. In a narrow sense, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer did not feel able to be honest before the election. They did not feel, when the Tories basically took advantage of a sort of momentary shift in the OBR weather vane and found themselves with a lot of spare cash and used it to cut national insurance, they were not honest that they could not follow, that they should not follow. The Tories said that they were going to pay for that by shrinking the civil service. Labour said they would not shrink the civil service and they would end austerity. They would increase public spending, but yet they would could also afford the tax cuts. That was always nonsensical, and it was always going to return to bite them. They then followed. They were then, they then followed the Tories by Jeremy Hunt by producing a budget with a staggeringly slim amount of headroom, and again said, this is it, one and done. This Tory black hole we've inherited, brackets, a third of which is due to our own public spending settlements, public pay settlements. That we won't need any more tax cuts and tax rises, and guess what? They did, and then they are busy telling everyone again that it's not their fault and it's magically down to Brexit or Liz Truss or whatever excuses they can come up with. And I do feel some sympathy for Rachel Reeves because very obviously her decisions a year ago have not helped growth. They've not helped the economy. They have made things worse. It turns out that as people in this room will know, it turns out that when you raise taxes on work, you get less work and you get fewer workers. And whether you whether you were tempted to say, no, we haven't raised national insurance, we've just raised employers' national insurance, the incidence is pretty much similar. And likewise, when you tax people who invest in this country, you get less investment. And when you have a period of, it's going to be almost 6 months, or even longer, since the first talk of tax cuts in the budget, which has basically chilled investment across the economy since April, which is an extraordinarily long time for people to be sitting on their hands. So, and as I sort of indicated there, I'm not just blaming Reeves for this. I think Tory politicians haven't been honest as well. They haven't been honest that tax cuts have to be paid for. That there are some things government cannot actually afford to do. But in the broader sense, politicians haven't been honest with voters about... So my fundamental analysis is what we're seeing now is, accelerated by the pandemic, accelerated by various other factors, is a crunch that was always coming. A fundamental mismatch between what people want to spend and what we can afford to spend. And it's a fundamental crunch and fundamental mismatch that is happening in every pretty much every advanced economy. Although I'm not sure advanced is the word we should be using for ourselves and much of Europe at this point. But essentially, an aging population and a welfare state are putting an enormous squeeze on the long-term capacity of the tax base to afford it. The point, if you look at what the government is spending money on, the 6 biggest spending items that we spend money on are old age pensions, the NHS, working age welfare, now debt interest, education, and there's one other which I'm forgetting. Hang on. Pensions, welfare, NHS, debt interest, education, and I think it's transport. But all, education. But all of the big items we are spending money on, all of the big ones are going up and increasing faster than the economy is growing. And faster than the economy has grown at any point. Elderly welfare is growing. Working age welfare overall is sort of holding steady, but the disability and incapacity component of that is growing absolutely hugely. Debt interest is soaring. Defence is growing, which actually is probably necessary. The NHS is growing. And if you look at what's coming next, this odd thing about this budget is that the crunch was meant to come next year. Because in order to square the circle I talked about earlier, Reeves's spending plans were to massively reduce public spending in the first 2 years of the 5 years, and then have utterly implausible austerity, near austerity in the third, fourth, and fifth year, in the hope that growth would turn up. So if you look at what happens to public spending growth this year and next year, it's kind of 4 or 5%. It then drops to 1 or 2%. It then drops below, theoretically, it drops below 1%, and that is including the NHS. So effectively, large parts of the public sector are going to see a real terms pay cut in the back half of this Parliament. That is not something Labour backbenchers are going to put up with. And so we are going to have, I'm afraid, a really grim sort of collision between the size of the state and the size of the tax base. And I mean, John's going to talk about growth, and we love growth and we need growth, but growth is not enough. To get public spending, to keep the share of public spending we are spending on the elderly constant over the next 50 years, we need growth of 2.9% per year. That's our calculation at the Centre for Policy Studies. Let's round it up to 3%. It will not shock anyone to know we have not had growth at 3%. In fact, if you look at GDP per capita since the 1980s, we have been stuck in an Indiana Jones movie. The ceiling has been coming down on us. Every decade, the booms are getting less boomy and the busts are getting more busty. The overall, the Bank of England estimates that the productive capacity of the economy, its ability to grow, is now somewhere around 1.5, 1.7% before it overheats. This is abjectly appalling territory. And that, again, has come because politicians have not been honest. They've not been honest with people about what we can afford. They've not been honest with people about the fact that if you want to pay for pensions, if you want to pay for the triple lock, you need to build houses, you need to build railways, you need to unblock some of the obstacles in the economy. We've essentially told everyone that that nothing needs to change and they can all be very happy. And that's simply not true. I've only got 2 minutes left, which is good because I'm just at my final point. It's now like a couple of weeks ago. It was the 100th birthday of Margaret Thatcher, who founded the Centre for Policy Studies and is the sort of patron deity of quite a lot of the people in this room. As part of that, I went back and wrote a big essay for the CPS on what Thatcherism should mean today, and what not kind of slavishly copying, but like what we can learn from the spirit of what she said. And the most obvious things were she made an argument. In every sentence, every paragraph, every speech, she was making an argument from principle. And it was often an argument people didn't agree with. People would say things like, are wages too high? And she would say, yes, wages are too high. Because unless we can actually compete with Germany or Japan or America, we can't actually earn a living. She would, people say, are we spending enough on the NHS? She'd say, well, we want to spend more on the NHS, but it has to be paid for. It comes from the money that I earn, the money you earn. She would make arguments that people found uncomfortable in a way that we have sort of completely lost the habit of. And she would also just say things which were plain common sense. And one of the most common sense things she said, very, very early in her days as leader of the opposition, was, if you are borrowing too much, it is because you are spending too much. If you are spending too much, you must stop spending. Ladies and gentlemen, we are borrowing too much. We are borrowing 100 billion plus too much. And it is because we are spending too much. And if we are spending too much, it is because we need to stop spending. And instead we have a system of fiscal rules and a fiscal approach which is essentially built on the principle of Lord make me chaste but not yet. Every chancellor we have run a surplus only sort of 5 times in the last 50 years. And one of the main reasons we've done that is because every chancellor promises to be thrifty in the 5th year of their forecast. And every year, then the 5th year turns into the 6th year, and the 6th year turns into the 7th year. We did a beautiful thing at the CPS looking at OBR forecasts, and we found out that in every single fiscal forecast under the OBR and before it, every forecast that is in the OBR's database, which goes back to the 1990s, we have never projected that we will spend more money in the 5th year than we actually end up spending. We have a structural bias towards lying to ourselves about the shape of the public finances. And until we change that, until we get honest with ourselves that we can only spend what we can afford, we will be absolutely screwed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that honest and dire assessment of our economic situation. Just before I welcome on our next speaker, I just realised I didn't actually fully introduce myself at the start. I'm Harry Richer. I'm the director of Fighting for a Free Future, working under our chairman, the Right Honourable Steve Baker. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Liam, Luke and Laura, who are part of the Fighting for a Free Future team, who today would also not be possible without. So now I'm pleased to welcome Maxwell Marlow, who will be speaking about housing and planning.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to start with 5 facts, statistics, pointers about the crisis that we're facing currently. And the first is to follow on from Rob, from the Centre for Policy Studies. We have a 6.5 million unit housing deficit. That means if we took all of the net immigration since the year 2000, which is about 4.5 million, we would still have a housing crisis, even if we just stopped people from coming. The second fact is that 1 in 30 children in the UK are living in temporary accommodation. That means they can't afford the rent, they're stuck in emergency, small, cramped conditions where they struggle to grow up, to have a fulfilling start to their lives, and fundamentally have their lives curtailed because of this. The third point is some research from the Adam Smith Institute. English renters work, on average, for 125 days before tax to pay their landlord. In London, they work for 146 days before tax. The fourth point is that the total value of UK land and real estate is worth £1 billion more than all of the private markets in the UK. So all of that work you do day in, day out, still not worth the roofs over our heads and the land under our feet. And the fifth point, and I think this speaks particularly to not just Rob's point, but also to our regulatory structure. There hasn't been a single new application to build a building over 8 stories in England and Wales since the 14th of June because of the building safety regulator. This is a crisis long in the making. UK households are disproportionately exposed to real estate and land than any of our G7 peers. We spend more of our money not investing in equities or bonds, but instead into brick, mortar, wire, and wood. That is a crazy suggestion, because whilst we have seen massive asset inflation, over 250% in real estate since the 1990s, our companies have not grown so quickly, and they would have done if we decided to move that money into capital markets. I think fundamentally it speaks to our risk-averse nature as a country, and because of that, legislation and regulation have followed instead. The Town and Country Planning Act, for example, one of the great behemoths of the Attlee government, has become a core part of the British political system, defended by Labour, of course, by the Conservative Party and by the Liberal Democrats, and most interestingly, by the Green Party, who don't want anything built anywhere at all. Indeed, the TCPA introduced something we call green belts, which made it illegal to build on 12.5% of the UK's land. They created green nooses around our growth hubs, our cities. If you look, for example, at Birmingham or Manchester or Leeds or London, it is impossible for those cities to expand. And guess what that does to growth? Guess what that does to families who want to move to those cities and start a better life? Guess what that does to companies who want to come and invest in London when all the land has run out? But even at that point, last week there was some analysis that was released by Marlow, a real estate analysis company, which showed that over half of London is unviable to build in, even if you removed the value of land and removed the S106 and SIL requirements. Developers still couldn't sell the houses that they want to build. They can't recycle the capital, and they can't build new projects. And you can also look, for example, at our approved documents, what it is that you are allowed to build even if you get the opportunity. Our approved documents currently stand at over 1,300 pages. This building would be impossible and illegal to build, and look at how glorious this is. Just yesterday, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government released a tweet about Labour's ambition to build, baby, build. The houses they generated on AI to show would be illegal to be built. Their windows are too large, and there is no flat entrance to the doors. So, sorry, Labour, you can't even build what you're tweeting. And just to really show the insanity of our planning laws, councils have to apply to planning permission in their own boroughs to cut down dying trees in the parks they own. Farmers cannot invest in new buildings beyond strict rules, which were actually helpfully liberalised under Robbie Moore last year, and something I've called for, liberalising even further. And up until recently, even if you, as a private citizen, owned two buildings next to one another, you couldn't knock down the walls in between them and conjoin them. That's because councils had regulated to decrease to maintain the stock of dwellings. I don't know about you, but that's insane. And that is exactly what our planning system is doing to our economy. This is not indicative of a brave, free, adventurous society, a free society. It is a system of Lilliputian regulations which one-on-one strangle down and constrain our economy and the livelihoods of the people who want to make this country great. So, and I'm going to finish a little bit early, I've got 5 minutes, but some things that can be done for the policymakers in the room, for people who are caring and do want to make our planning system much more sensible. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill isn't great, but it's better than nothing. And I think we should be urging the government to go faster, be more courageous, and to actually come back again for a second time with some really big reforms to actually unblock our land and our buildings. The building safety regulator, as I mentioned earlier, which, by the way, if you're building over 8 stories, you have to submit every architectural detail, every bit of construction detail, every bit of planning to be manually checked by civil servants. You wouldn't treat any other asset that way. Imagine if you went to a bank, you said, I want to buy all this equity, I need to do a line-by-line report on every little bit of that company, up and down, for every single stock purchase you want to make. Insane. Anyway, that's our regulator for high-rise buildings at the moment. That needs complete and utter reform, and I urge people here to work with Chris Curtis and Mike Reeder, who may be Labour MPs, but are really pushing the government to change this, and Gareth Bacon has also been very, very good on this. I would also abolish the pernicious stamp duty, which Kemi did a wonderful job of bringing up, and it's something the Adam Smith Institute are pushing the Treasury to completely abolish. Our own analysis shows that it would pay for itself after year 10, just from the increase in productivity alone, never mind the new building that would happen. We would also, fundamentally recommend you read and back Councillor Lord Bailey's new report out this morning, Get London Building, which has got a really good group of policy recommendations fundamentally. But if you want to be really brave, and I really do urge you to be brave about this, you could repeal the Town and Country Planning Act 1947, the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. And you could move to a zonal planning system, which works, which gives liberty to developers and to communities to build what they want to build. And finally, I would say, no matter what party you're in, you can build, baby, build. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maxwell. That was absolutely fantastic, and it's wonderful to hear positivity at the end about what we can do to improve our country. It's absolute pleasure of mine to welcome next our keynote speaker, our keynote address, Lord John Moynihan, who will be speaking about the return to growth and some more ways in which we can get Britain going again.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thanks, Rob, for that super optimistic speech, and Maxwell, everything I quite agreed with what he had to say. And I look forward to what the panel have to say about all this as well, because it's a great group of people. So, I mean, people of my era always go back to the Second World War in our pale, stale male way. So let's start with post-war Europe. In general, the countries, whether defeated or victorious, embraced the principle of classical liberal free market economics and grew like a weed. All over Europe, there was tremendous economic growth, and gradually people recovered from the trauma of war, and they all began to build wealth quite stupendously, so long as, of course, they weren't under the thumb of Russia, but forget the people behind the Iron Curtain. So that was wonderful, except for one country which went into an absolute disastrous experiment with socialism under the 1945 Labour government, which set Britain back for years and years while the rest of Europe grew dramatically. And of course, we learned precisely the wrong lesson for that, because by the time we said, gosh, those chaps over in Europe seem to be doing really quite well, so we should really join them. I mean, we're a disaster here in the UK, so let's join in with this wonderfully successful group of countries. By the time we got there, they had started to double down on an economic political system called social democracy. And bit by bit, they had, by the time we joined the EU in the early 1970s, they had started to fully embrace the principle of social democracy, which is exactly the opposite, the opposite is communism, but it's going towards the opposite of classical liberal free market economics. So just as we joined the common market, so the whole principle of how you run an economy was rapidly changing. What does social democracy look like? High expenditure, as Rob was saying, a larger and larger state, massive social benefits, absolutely stultifying regulation, as Maxwell illustrated in just one part of the economy, building, a regulation that is a rule for everything and every product as to how life should be conducted. And in the classical, very true saying, classical liberal economics says everything that isn't forbidden is allowed. As long as we haven't absolutely said that you can't stab one in the street, you can do quite a lot. And in fact, that leads you into the whole free speech argument, which is absolutely at the core of what we're trying to accomplish on the right in terms of having free markets, free speech, and free market economics. In social democracy, the rule is if it's not allowed, then it's forbidden. And that's the classic difference between the Napoleonic Code, if it's not allowed, it's forbidden, and the common law, if it's not forbidden, it's allowed. And that is actually why this country invented half of the modern world, the other half mostly being invented by the United States, but we started it. In the ferment of the 1700s and the early 1800s, we accomplished, through free speech and an absolutely correct constitution, we accomplished the Enlightenment, which led to the ferment of ideas, the scientific revolution, which gave us the tools, and the industrial revolution, which gave us the application of those tools into building a modern economy. And we've forgotten all that. We've forgotten that the way to do that is to have everything allowed except that which is explicitly forbidden. And we've fervently embraced the continental idea, which has always been a disaster, of everything that's not forbidden, that's not allowed, that's not specifically permitted, is forbidden. And at that point, we get very low growth in the social democracies from the 1970s onwards. And the growth is going down and down and down until the EU is the only large economic bloc where growth is absolutely down. All around the world, economies are growing, people are getting richer, people are able to meet their needs, and indeed scientific invention and revolution is occurring, but not in the EU. And this was the main reason why people like me and Steve and Bernard Jenkins wanted to leave the EU, and indeed Andrew Griffith, of course, wanted to leave the EU because we wanted to get out of that stultifying economic system that prevented growth. And then as you move further forward in social democracies, it goes completely bonkers because there's a fundamental idea that they share with communism that we know best. We can define the perfect society. And it's okay if everything else is forbidden because we've defined it by rules absolutely perfectly. And so you don't need to explore anything else. Just do as we say and everything will be absolutely lovely. And this whole we know best idea moves on into woke and moves on into this whole series of moral panics that we've had year after year. Whether it's Black Lives Matter or net zero or whatever, they're just some concept, and if you deviate 1 inch from that, because anything that's not explicitly allowed is forbidden, then you are, disgraceful and need to be cancelled and so on and so forth. So in this country, we got policies now that are absolutely, on an objective basis, mad. We closed down North Sea oil. And by the way, this is an equality of party attack because it was the Conservatives that did this. Just idiotic. We closed down North Sea oil. We taxed it crazy so that everybody stopped drilling anyway. Now we're refusing to give more licenses. Now the whole petrochemicals industry in the United Kingdom goes to the wall. Jim Ratcliffe has to move out, has to close down his refinery. Chemicals no longer are made. The last ammonia plant in the UK is closed down. Ammonia is the essential feedstock, which created from North Sea gas, that drives the pharmaceutical industry, the petrochemicals industry, all sorts of things. So now there's no real reason for the pharmaceuticals industry, one of the jewels in the crown of our economy, to be here. There's a dégringolade of most of British manufacturing, bit by bit, leaving this country and going elsewhere because we've now got the highest electricity prices in the world, because we got no gas, we're importing energy from elsewhere. This is quite clearly mad, but yet we've got people cheering on this whole net zero idea when the rest of the world is just walking away from it, but we're doubling down on it. Now, of course, when you take Rob's idea that we've got far too big a state, it's now up to 45 and growing percentage of the economy. What is the really awful thing about that? It's that you have to increase taxes to pay for it. If you don't increase taxes, you'll have the sort of problem that Rob was talking about. And if you increase taxes, nobody invests in this country, because one of the things that they've been doing recently is putting taxes on business, because you're not going to tax the people because they won't vote for you. So I'm just looking at the time and I'm running out of it. So if you tax business no longer comes to this country. And then that's not going enough. So you say, well, tax the rich. These bastards can pay for it. Well, if you tax the rich, they'll leave the country. Well, if they leave the country, the hell to them. Who needs them? Okay, so where are you going to get the taxes? Oh, well, we'll tax the slightly less rich. Well, they'll leave the country. Well, the hell to them. Why, they don't love their country. Let them go. Well, okay, where are you going to get the money? So bit by bit, and it was in my book, and it's in this latest book, Prosperity Through Growth, that Matthew Elliott and Art Laffer and others wrote. We say, okay, you're just destroying the economy. Well, who cares? Because we know best. Vote for me, the basic ploy of social democracy, and I'll give you free stuff. And you don't have any responsibilities anymore, because I'll take care of those. You only have rights. And that's why we can't stand the EHCR. So we're unique in the world, in the EU plus this social democratic country that we have here, that growth has collapsed. And we all know how to solve it. If you want to read my book or Growth Through Prosperity, it's all in there. It's very straightforward. The key problem is how to get elected if you're going to cut a third of the benefits that people get in the way that Rob was describing. And that comes, to my sort of, I hope, final point. Sorry, I've lost my timer. I've got a bit. My final point. Okay, well, if we all know what to do, and I think in this room we do all know what to do. How do you do it? How do you get elected so as to do it? So the latest fashion is reform. Now, I think everybody got Wales wrong last week. They didn't see that what happened was tactical voting. The Labour voters abandoned Labour to get Plaid Cymru in so as to stop reform getting it. And that's going to happen in the next election. You'll see tactical voting like you've never seen before. I can't do a Trump accent. But Plaid Cymru are going to vote for Labour. Labour are going to vote for Plaid Cymru and for Lib Dem. Lib Dem are going to vote for Labour. A whole bunch of Conservatives who don't like reform are going to vote Lib Dem. And all in a bid not to allow reform to form a government. And I think that's the lesson we learned from last week, and it's extremely worrying, because classically about 55% of the electorate has been left-wing, has been keen on getting free stuff, and 45 right-wing keen on responsibilities and the like. So the second issue about reform is, will they embrace classical free market economics? And they haven't done so yet. Danny Kruger was on the radio this morning, embracing it sort of in a very small way, but he was talking about millions. I can say this million, that million. He wasn't talking about billions. So in general, reform flinches when it's asked to be flinty. And so far, they haven't embraced a way of doing what Margaret Thatcher did, which is to say, look, this is why you've got to be this way. This is why our country needs it. Net, everybody ends up relying on an IMF moment. Andrew, who is with Kemi, I think, very hard right in terms of, I don't mean hard in a nasty way, I mean hard on economics, is coming up with a free market approach. And it is to be hoped that the whole Conservative Parliamentary Party will get behind the policies that he's going to be promulgating. But above all, we then have to unite the right with reform. I'm sorry, but there's just no way that we're going to get into power to put these policies into place unless there's a way of cohabiting with reform. Otherwise, we split the right, and it's going to be even worse than I've just described. Absent that, everybody's relying on an IMF moment. Oh, we'll call the IMF in, just like we did in 1975, and they'll sort us out, and then somebody decent will be hired. Will be elected. Now, what do we mean by an IMF moment? For a start, it needs pretty much economic collapse, and we ain't there yet by any means. We're getting there, but we're not there. But it also needs the IMF to say we're going to devote some of our resources and money to saving Britain. Guess what? They don't give a something T about us. They'll say, no, go away, sort yourselves out. We haven't got much money left, and we give it to other places. So there'll be no IMF moment, so it will go further down the plug hole, and that leads us to needing a Millet moment. And it's wonderful news that Millet has been accepted, but we're quite a long way from the kind of catastrophe that Argentina was having before Millet was elected. So we're heading towards Argentina, while Argentina is heading towards, being a beacon for the world, in my view, and let's just hope he keeps on. So in short, things look bleak, unlike Rob's optimism. But guess what? We have to offer hope. We have to show what recovery looks like. We have to show what happens when you have economic growth and all the benefits that creates for all of society. We need to unite the right. We need to make the case for those who get up every day and go to work without much benefit from the state and who are paying for all of this and who are increasingly fed up. And to do that, we have to have a much smaller public sector. We have to have many more people working in the private sector. And above all, we have to find those Millet voters, the people who said, well, yeah, I'm benefiting from all this free stuff, but I reject it. I'm going to elect somebody who will make my country great again, or whatever. And I think that's the task before us. I don't think we've found the way to do that yet. And I look forward to what the panel has to say about how we can manage that.
Thank you so much, Lord Moynihan. Thank you so much to all of our speakers so far. I think what I've really taken from it is that the UK is in a very, very bad state, but we certainly have the people here who know how to fix it, and we have history on our side. We have the ideas ready, largely ready to go, and it just takes getting the electorate, getting the government, getting politicians and the people on side so that we can make Britain great again. It's my pleasure now to welcome our chairman, Steve Baker, onto the stage, who'll be introducing our panel, which will have a wonderful discussion, and we'll begin by reacting to Lord Moynihan's speech.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us here. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you. Can I please invite me to join on stage John O'Connell from the Taxpayers Alliance, Harry Wilkinson from the GWPF, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, Fred de Fossard from the Prosperity Institute, and John, would you please also join us? Please join me in welcoming So Christian Niemitz from the IA has sent his apologies. We hope he's all right. The first thing I want to say is a huge thank you to John, because when I read John's book, The Return to Growth, I thought, wow, this is fantastic. We do actually know what to do. And I think sometimes we forget that. So, Harry, can I ask you, great expert in energy, what's your reaction to what you've heard?
Thank you. I think there's a lot to be inspired by there. I think listening to the remarks, we're reminded that it is about telling stories to the public that they can engage with. And certainly when it comes to energy, that story is a thermodynamic one. Nothing that happens in the economy you can think of, it doesn't involve energy. And so when we push that higher, as John was talking about, you add a kind of glue that slows everything down. So getting the cost of energy down has to be at the heart of what we do next.
John, Rob really brilliantly set out how deeply we're in trouble, but that, of course, is the Taxpayers Alliance bread and butter. Spending, taxation, you've done the spending plan as well as the taxation. It was Tax 2020, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2020 came and went, and the tax system didn't get any simpler, so we might have to move that out to 2030 maybe. But yeah, in 2012, the TPA published the single income tax, which is still our Bible for how we think the tax system ought to look and to operate, which is obviously much more simple and neutral as well, which is quite important, that there's no deliberate decision by a politician or a bureaucrat on what particular industry they like or they favour, and using the tax system as a lever to implement that decision, that the tax system is neutral in how people make their income, as long as it's done by legal means. Then, you know, the tax system ought to be neutral in that decision-making process. Tax simplicity is in and of itself a good thing, of course, but arguably the problem's got worse. The Office for Tax Simplification was set up and has been subsequently disbanded. But yeah, we're now, the tax code's at something approaching 25,000 pages. And when George Osborne came into office, it was 11,000 pages. So we see that the problem's got much worse. And is bound to get worse as long as politicians accept that first principle of, we must spend this much money, we just need to find a way to pay for it. That will lead them chasing their tails and doing silly things like raising employers' national insurance because of a manifesto pledge, and that adds complication. It throws businesses out of kilter and obviously kills growth.
I was looking for the hope and the optimism.
The hope and the optimism are in the single income tax, and look, I'll give you another sort of more anecdotal piece of optimism, something that Lord Moynihan struck on at the end of his speech, that there are going to be a lot of people around the country that do benefit from free stuff, but are probably ready to hear about politicians talk about responsibility and the removal of said free stuff. My sense is that that's very true. When the TPA, we operate around the country, we do a lot of work outside SW1, and I go and visit lots of businesses, small businesses up and down high streets around the country, and talk to lots of individuals. And there is a very significant cohort of people, in my view, who are ready to hear some tough truths. And they are ready to hear, when they know that, that over 50% of the country are net recipients of the state, which I think is work that CPS have done, and others in the room. They know that that's too much. And they know that the country needs to live within its means. And it's going back to those simple messages about them living within your means that I think people are actually ready to hear.
Yeah, John, thanks very much. Now, Fred, the Prosperity Institute has spent many years cataloguing the elements of the ingredients of prosperity. How do you react to what we've heard? And in particular, do we know what to do?
Thank you very much for the question. This is obviously a morning of violent agreement, not rather than dissent, but hopefully I can add a little bit more additional insight on this one. We've sort of gone through a period, maybe 25 years, I think essentially since the end of the Cold War, of thinking that all of the great problems were solved, and now is the time for indulging ourselves with lots of luxury beliefs, which I think have manifested in one of our great bugbears at the Institute, the sort of ESG architecture, what we like to call woke capitalism. Think about this in terms of what it has meant for the erosion of freedom of association, for the ability to businesses to act and to grow and do what they wish, and even for us to defend ourselves. One small example I've found recently is that any business that works in the nuclear weapons supply chain, which is therefore basically the entirety of the British defence sector, gets really aggressively penalised for the S in ESG. So the way they compensate for that is they go big on G, governance, by going huge on diversity and diversity, equality and inclusion, which is completely anti-meritocratic, and they go even bigger on net zero, which ruins their profit margins and pursues completely false aims like turning our tanks from diesel to batteries. Complete madness. So you think about the amount of money which is thrown down the drain on hair harebrained schemes which just do not work. And we've moved so far away from the core fundamentals of what makes a good and welcoming business environment. And we need to go back to those first principles of freedom of association, property rights, essentially, and backed up by John's TPA vision of the single income tax.
So, John, thank you very much indeed for your remarks, and thank you for writing the book. And by the way, I thought it was very good of you to acknowledge the other book that's just come out to add to the panoply. Could you tell us a little bit about the process that led you to write the book? Because I hope people here have read it. It really is the manual for what needs to be done. What was the process that led you to do that work, and how did you really get across all that detail, and in particular your plans for how spending reduction needs to work?
Thanks, Steve. I think I suffered from the hubris of somebody who's done well in business. And what happens is that they start thinking that they're smarter than they really are. And so they move from outside the world of business into politics or indeed economics. And you'll find many examples, and almost none of them actually have any good ideas. And quite possibly that can or will be applied to me by some people's views. But in 2012, I got quite upset about quantitative easing and the whole bailout of the banks when they should have been allowed to go bust, and we could have started again from the beginning. And so I started to give speeches around the world that sort of kind of caught fire in those days. I was even those days I was getting like 1 million views on one speech, and so I began to feel that maybe I was a real hotshot smart fella, and sort of got dragged in by the aforementioned Matthew Elliott into Business of Britain and then Vote Leave, and then brilliantly the Electoral Commission, after we won the referendum, dragged me into 3 years of lawfare, which just made me totally pissed off with the regulatory state and the way that they could go after people. Just this last week, there's a very great man, I better not mention his name, who was in court because he had given, I think, like £500,000 to Vote Leave in 2016. He was in court 10 years later, nearly 10 years later, because they decided that they were going to tax him. You have a referendum, you have a referendum law, which was done by Jack Straw, that says there'll be citizens on either side who fund the campaigns. That's what the law says. State won't pay for this referendum, it'll be citizens. And so a bunch of citizens who thought we should leave the EU gave money to Vote Leave, and 6 months after the referendum, after they'd received certain representations, I believe from Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson, but that's probably libel, they suddenly started sending out letters saying, oh, you owe gift tax on that. And so this person who'd given at least £500,000 is told, you owe £200,000 to HMRC for having participated in this democratic exercise as the law asked people to, public-spirited people to do. He was still in court last week fighting this, and he fights it on principle. And several of the donors have been forced to pay hundreds of £1,000s. That's lawfare. Anyway, I got lawfare, so then I was really pissed off, and I started getting a lot more full-time in
So you might as well make even more enemies with your book.
Exactly. I sort of want to talk about what you've asked me to talk about, but I wanted to throw in a little about what John said about this whole tax thing. It's quite interesting. First they came for the non-doms, and we all said, well, yeah, they should pay tax, and they all buggered off. So then they go for the millionaires and the centimillionaires, and then they all buggered off. And now they're coming down the pike. They got to the lawyers, which all of us, including Shakespeare, would think was not a bad thing. But here's what's happening now. All these people have left. They've gone to somewhere like Dubai. Now they're educating their children, and British schools are opening up in Dubai, right? And British accountants are leaving the UK and going to Dubai. And British lawyers are going to and leaving Dubai. And the main place that lawyers work in the United Kingdom is in the city. And we've got this huge infrastructure that has led to the city becoming the greatest place for financing in the world until a few years ago. They're all leaving. The lawyers are saying, don't you dare, not let me have an LLP, because I'll just be off. And bit by bit, the city is being dismantled. And nobody ever wants to be on the London Stock Exchange. Why? Because you're required to have an ESG statement. And you're required to tell the London Stock Exchange every year how well you're doing on that statement, how well you're doing on diversity, how well you're doing on net zero. And you say to somebody who's an entrepreneur and wants to put their company on the stock exchange, well, this is what you have to do if you go to London Stock Exchange. He says, oh, that's very interesting. I'll go to NASDAQ. And that's why nobody is listing on the city, on the London Stock Exchange anymore. And that's why the City of London is imploding. And just think what it means for this country if the City of London is just gotten rid of.
Well, now that is a very good point. Now, we've got a reassuringly youthful audience here, and I want to talk about the future. So, John, Rob set out age-related spending as a big issue. What does the future look like if we don't change course?
Oh, grim. Even if you drill it down to council level, local authorities have quite restricted room on what they can actually do with their discretionary spending, because a lot of it is tied up in adult social care. That is going to get worse over the years, not better, unless there's some sort of magic reform. Yeah, the demographics are just going to put further pressure on that. I think that's part of the reason why people are starting to realise that the system is rigged against them when they're younger. And we did a piece of work where we looked at benefits and enhanced personal independence payments, through which you can then obtain a new car on the Motability scheme. And the conditions under which you can claim said new car include tennis elbow, writer's cramp, acne, and much more besides. Once people start to see through some of this stuff, that's when it starts to feel to me to be that's enough. The people that we talk to when we go around the country, a lot of the ballooning bill for benefit spending on unfortunately quite spurious mental health conditions sometimes, that comes up a lot. People are starting to realise, hang on a minute, we can't afford this. And we're paying people to sit at home when it's better for them to be at work. These kind of conversations are coming up all the time. So
people are not fools, right?
They are not fools.
I'm going to come to Harry about energy in a minute, but I've realised I can't bear an empty chair. Maxwell, would you mind coming up? Because I want to ask you about housing in a second. Well, Harry, we've got to change the terrain of debate, and an area where there's been enormous success in changing the terrain of debate. And I wonder if I know any practical politicians who've had something to do with it. But absolutely at the heart of that campaign was you. You were one of the absolute heroes behind changing the terrain of debate on energy policy and net zero. What were the keys to making that campaign a success?
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate everything you have done as well on this important topic. I think key has been the pain that high energy costs have had on ordinary people. Real people work in refineries like Grangemouth, Lindsay Oil Refinery, in high energy businesses around the country, working class, blue collar, high skilled, high paid jobs that the Labour Party in particular was designed to protect. They abandoned those people. And we have to tell the personal stories of people who are affected by these policies. I think governing from a free market perspective should be a lot easier, because when you deregulate, you unleash the capacity that's always there for people to thrive, to invest, to work, to really put all of their efforts into growing the economy. And when you take away those regulations, that doesn't cost the Treasury anything. And yet it's so hard for them to realise that this will have the benefits that it will have. So I think the next step has to be looking at how the OBR model changes that you would make, because although, take energy, for example, we apply ETS costs, emissions trading scheme costs, onto wholesale electricity prices. That feeds through even on renewables. We're paying ETS price on that electricity as well. So yes, there would be a revenue loss if you cut that, as Claire Coutinho has proposed, but the benefits to the economy from that weight that you're reducing off it, I don't think is being properly recognised in the models.
Thank you, Harry. We're going to come to the audience in a moment, but I'm going to ask, first of all, Fred, what is the Prosperity Institute's recipe for success?
That's a great question. It's a good follow-on from what John and Harry were saying, both about welfare and energy, which, while they are different, there's something I think there's a few areas where they can be combined thematically. The argument needs to be one with the public, and I think is making headway. I think Harry and you have done obviously fantastic work on energy. Welfare, I mean, the taxpaying public despise the welfare state and have done for a very long time, and we're sort of back to that sort of 2000s and recession-era rage at welfare dependency, and we have a sort of taxpayer consciousness which is really emerging on that one. For the long-term reforms I would love to see, we need to start working out how to do it by age cohort, but starting to move the state pension and public sector pensions to funded rather than unfunded ones, and I think a way of developing, and the public need to realise that the public sector pension in many respects is a lie, because they might think that because it looks nice on their payslip that they have quite a large contribution from their employer. If it's being paid for out of the current tax base, that's kind of a phantom piece of money and doesn't really exist. And the success in the last 12, 15 years or so of greater private pensions in this country is something that should be built on and emphasised, and we could move over public sector pensions that way, and also find a way of developing the sort of Singaporean style personal welfare and health accounts for we can look after our care in the long term, which would be enabled to be done in a more sustainable fashion with the Maxwell Marlow planning reform vision to actually make it easier to build houses, care homes, hospitals, urgent care centres, all of these things which are currently gummed up in planning. And onto energy, I think there's a sort of long-term and short-term thing to look at. For one, it's worth reflecting that the peak North Sea oil and gas production in Britain, I think, was 2003. Harry, correct me if I'm wrong on that one. And it has declined not because of the basin necessarily completely emptying. It has declined because the government chose to decline it. It chose to stop issuing licenses, and it chose to start being more dependent on imports since the 2000s. Obviously, you can't necessarily stand up an oil and gas well immediately and get it pumping overnight, but it's something there needs to be a very, very clear strategy from the entirety of the right on to send signals to businesses and investors that if a right-wing government is looking much more likely after the next general election, that can be activated quite quickly. And to the more short-term stuff, one thing we're really interested in is UK-EU relations, because of course the Legatum Institute wrote many, many papers on the future trading relationship with Europe by Shankar Singham, which I'm sure many people in this room helped and contributed to. And the reset, I think, with the European Union that the government wants to pursue, I think is very dangerous, particularly on energy policy, because they want to increase the ETS costs that British businesses will pay. And they're justifying this by saying, now British manufacturers exporting to the European Union won't have to pay the EU's CBAM, which will therefore make them more competitive. But I think there's a couple of big fallacies here. One, we don't only export to the European Union. Many British businesses sell to British people, and many British businesses sell to the United States, which is of course our largest bilateral trading partner. So we're making costs more expensive for British customers and for customers overseas. Does the United States know that we're putting up a trade barrier between them and us? I'd love to know. And two, we shouldn't really worry about avoiding the European Union CBAM because the European Union as a customer market is collapsing under the own failed assumptions of European policy, which John was talking about. So it really, really is choosing to shackle us to a sinking ship. And the final point, which is back to welfare here, but is also the bigger theme on general deregulation, the sweetener you need for cutting welfare aggressively is massive deregulation of the labour market, which I'm pleased the Shadow Business Secretary is in the room because he's leading the campaign against the Employment Rights Bill. That has to be a day one repeal that the Conservative Party, the Reform, that any party that considers itself remotely pro-enterprise enacts, because you can't necessarily cut people's welfare while also not cutting the burdens and taxes on businesses that stop employing people.
Brilliant. Now, I imagine there's a few people in this room would like housing to be a little bit less expensive. Yeah, just a few. Now, Maxwell, we were talking about the absorption rate before we started. Do you want to just explain to people what the absorption rate is and what it means for house prices?
Yes, of course. So the absorption rate is when a house builder brings new stock online, they don't release all of it and from the land in order to not decrease the price of the asset. fundamentally. There's two reasons for that. One, it's down to what's on the developer's books and can they recycle that capital. If it's too depreciated, they can't recycle the capital properly, they can't report it in their profits at the end of the year, and therefore their shareholders get very upset with them and the capital starts flowing. That's the first instance. The second instance is there's a bit of a pact with the government over this and why they don't want to bring house prices down. As I mentioned in my speech earlier, British people are remarkably overexposed to property markets in the UK. It is the number one source of wealth for the majority of households. So when you get to retirement age, you sell your property, you liquidate the asset, and you live on the returns from it. If we saw a collapse in the property markets, people's wealth would be destroyed overnight. Imagine the riots in the street. So that's kind of the kind of pact that happens in those areas, and it's a concern because there's issues around land banking and can we bring those planning permissions forward, whatever else. Yes, that there is an issue there, but overall we're a little bit too far down the road now to basically say we need to collapse the property market, which fundamentally economically we need to do in order to bring about a revolution in housing. And just to one point which isn't captured in policy, and it's not very wonky, but it's about anger in the British economy and British people. The reason they're going to reform, the reason they're voting for your party or the Green Party or whatever else, is split down gendered lines fundamentally. And it speaks a lot to the increase in employers' national insurance contributions. Because young people have gone through COVID and we're yet to see a proper apology from the Conservatives on this actually towards young people, locking young people in their homes for a disease which didn't really affect them that much, piling them up with debt, making them do Zoom University, the strain it placed on their relationships, that carries through to now. Now they can't get a job. So that degree that they were locked in their flat for, paying all that money to attend university, isn't translating into work. They're becoming angry. They're rejecting the two main parties. That's something we need to keep in mind when we talk about policy, is that, yes, it's all very well tweaking energy policy, it's very well and good doing ESG stuff. That's just icing on the cake. The cake itself is of an incredibly angry bomb, which if we don't sort out, we end up like France. And what's happening in France? Their pensioner spending is completely intractable. It's going to bring down the government. Their economy is probably going to collapse. I'm worried if we don't sort out the anger problem now, we'll look like France in a few years. And speaking as a Brit, I don't want to look like France.
Very good, John, go.
The reason house prices are high is because there's more demand than supply. It's as straightforward as that. You've got to go back to classical liberal free markets economics. There's a shortage of about 5 million homes, or maybe more, in this country. And what happens is that, say you make 1 million homes in a year, the people who can afford it most, the richest, will be able to buy those homes. And anybody who hasn't got the money on the margin to bid more than those richest is out of luck. And they will bid up the price, everybody will bid up the price until the pips are squeaking on them, as this is the maximum they can possibly afford. That's all it is. And with respect to Kemi, changing stamp duty isn't going to change that situation at all. As long as there is more demand than supply, house prices will be stratospheric, just squeezing every penny they can. Now, I've got a suggestion. I mean, as to how to get house prices down, which nobody seems to talk about, and it's classical about a we know best aspect of life, the regulation. The big companies are accused of land banking, holding back their land and not building on it. Why don't they build on it? They'll tell you that what happens is they'll put forward a planning application. I want to build 100 houses. And the council says, fine, 20 of them have to be social housing. This is we know best. We know best how to get housing to poor people who can't afford it. All right? And if the council can, they'll say 25 have to be social housing. And whatever it is, the developer sees their entire profit squeezed straight out of the system because they have to give that social housing to the council. Here's my suggestion. Stop doing social housing on the back of the developer. If you want to do social housing, go and buy housing at the market price and let the developer do those 100 houses and sell them off. And the developer could then sell those houses off for 10 or 15% less. Suddenly house prices have dropped. than they needed to, and the absorption rate would suddenly be 100% very damn quickly on that particular estate. And yet, that is the pernicious aspect. When you get into the regulatory state, it's saying we know best is every single way this economy should be run, whether it's from net zero to housing or whatever. They've got the answer. Meantime, there are all these other regulations like bats. A few hundred bats get saved by preventing all sorts of development of the country, while 1 million bats a year get killed by these windmills out in the North Sea and so forth. Got to get rid of regulation. It's actually the worst of the three of large government, high taxes and regulation.
Yeah.
It's the worst.
The cure has become worse than the disease. So let's go over to the audience. Who would like to come in? Don't be shy. Right, Jonathan.
Yes, if we swap out, you can elsewhere. Jonathan.
Hello, Jonathan Isaby from the Growth Commission. Were the panel as confused as I was to read at the weekend an article by the man who was Chancellor backed raising corporation tax from 19% to 25%, advising us that raising taxes now would harm growth?
Well, that's a great question. Fred, I'm going to dump that one on you.
Marvellous question, Jonathan. I was a special advisor in that government, but albeit in a minor role. And it's funny thinking about how that lever was eventually pulled. And it reminds me of something that John said earlier on, which is this sort of false notion that businesses don't vote. And they're a kind of they're just a kind of easy hit. And it was a part of a complacency that set in Britain for quite a long time, where because we had a more competitive tax regime than most European countries, combined with just a fundamentally nicer business environment to work in, now was the time where we could throw a few rocks and squeeze it out of businesses that could afford to pay it. And because it was just politically easier than raising national insurance or income tax. And of course, this was a consequence of the, was it £400 billion we spent in the pandemic on support, which was, most of it was probably unnecessary and much of it damaging if you think about its medium-term effects. It was a great shame, and it was a sign of the Conservatives in office forgetting about the fundamental principles of economic policy and what makes for a good business environment. But also, as far as I can tell, there was also this endless debate that the pickup in corporation tax receipts in the second half of the 2010s, some people said, oh, that was just a cyclical thing, so therefore actually the headline rate doesn't matter, so you can go forward to increase it, or it was more to do with issues around allowances. And there was, in that uncertainty, I think the cabinet essentially decided, well, just tax businesses, they'll complain for a little bit, but they'll get used to it. And when you think along those kind of lines, that's where you end up with this very dangerous situation right now that John was describing of capital flight and people just leaving this country. It was a great shame, and hopefully something the Conservative Party can not do in the future.
A brief word from John, and then we'll go to Andrew.
Very, very quickly, we carried out some polling a few years ago that showed that to put it sort of as simply as possible, working class people were twice as likely to back cuts in corporation tax to upper middle class professional people. And we then did some focus grouping to find out why this was. And there was a chap in Stoke who said to our group, the business will just leave. So workers understand it. And they get it on quite a fundamental level. And yes, businesses don't vote, but the people who work for the businesses do. And when they don't get the wage increases that they were expecting, or they lose their job, then they certainly know about it. And that's called tax incidence. And the more that we get that across, the better.
Andrew, Shadow Secretary of State for Business.
Hi, thank you. I won't talk, but we've heard lots about the economic agenda. I wondered if the panel wanted to say anything about the intoxicating idea of individual freedom. We've had governments of all flavours that have tried to prescribe what we can and can't eat, what we can do with our bodies, and I think the time is prime, particularly as we think about a new, younger generation, to go back to first principles and talk about that, to talk about people's ability to take risk with their lives in a well-informed way. And I just say that, Steve, you can answer the question as well, because we are for free markets and freedom. There is a danger that we can always come across as very dry in terms of economics, but it's a heady idea that people can have their own individual freedom back.
Well, I'm going to
answer that then, since you invite me, and thank you very much. And then I'll come to Maxwell, because I want to hear some more of that anger. Look, I spent 14 years in Parliament banging on about freedom, and I'm obviously best known for Brexit and then COVID and net zero. But people forget, I think, that because of course who cared what I said in the 2010 to 15 Parliament, I spent an enormous amount of time saying we were going to run out of other people's money and clamping down. I did. I know the speeches are in the record. But very much to your point, God, I want people to enjoy themselves. Not harming other people, but that's why Harry and I and others, we put so much effort into fighting against lockdowns and restrictions. It was obvious to us that young people were entitled to be furious. I mean, everything being taken away from them, from nightclubs at the perhaps more frivolous end, but that matters, through to the hope of a job and prosperity. And young people, I think, have got a vast amount to be angry about. I would just say two things, one very serious and one a bit lighter. I have never taken narcotics of any kind. I said that once at Hustings, and somebody said to me, yeah, but you do adrenaline, alcohol, and I bet you've smoked. Yeah, but we're in a strange time now where it's funny, the police insist that they have to uphold the speech laws. But it's funny, they don't seem to uphold the cannabis laws. They seem to be able to choose not to do those. And I remember, shortly after I was first elected, on that point about freedom, saying to an audience, if we really want to get the prison population down, we're going to have to start thinking differently about the young people and choices that they're making about recreational drugs. And I was told afterwards by my chairman, never mention that again. It was very clear that I'd be deselected. Now, I say that as somebody who's never taken narcotics, but I just think we're in a crazy time now where we haven't faced up to what individual freedom really means. I don't want anyone to take narcotics. I hate smoking. But I think we're in a crazy position where the prisons are overflowing and we're still trying to tell people what to do with their own bodies. Now, that was not necessarily an area I wanted to get into today, because I don't think it's the area that ruins us in the future. The thing that ruins us in the future it's everything you talk about, Andrew. It's the economy grinding to a halt. But I want Maxwell to answer this point about general freedom, and I want to hear some of that anger.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So I'll disagree with you actually there, Steve, that our ruin lies purely in the economy. If you don't have the trust from the government to enjoy yourself, what you choose to do with your life, there is no point, I think, to living, fundamentally. And the last government was particularly reprehensible for this. Rishi Sunak obviously said in his wonderful column, I'm proud of three things: chess, cricket, and the smoking ban. Yes, and that bill has just come back to the House of Lords now, and I've done some data analysis. I've worked out that the generational smoking ban won't even create a smoke-free future, because that smoking rate's already going down quite a lot. Young people are consuming nicotine through other ways. So what we're going to do is trap a load of young people who buy cigarettes legally already into an illegal market. It's baffling. And then, trying to, speak to the Conservative Party about this now, and now it's back in the House of Lords. They're saying we don't want to oppose the general smoking ban because it would be not very nice to Mr. Sunak. Sorry, I don't care. It's a small thing. And vapes as well. The whole thing is a mess and a nonsense. And this is partly the reason why young people are so angry. Let's look at the pub. We see, for example, all these stats coming out about young people not drinking. It's because they can't afford to anymore. The amount of tax you pay on a pint is ginormous. Not to mention pubs can't stay open because of high electricity costs, or the new employment rights bill coming through, you have a banter ban. It's going to be obscene, and it's going to destroy a lot of what the freedoms that young people expect to have in a Western country. No wonder they're all looking at China and going, oh, that looks quite good with all their infrastructure, fantastic. Or the Russians, God, they look quite happy, don't they, through all that propaganda? They probably don't pay large taxes on vodka or whatever else. What does that mean for Western society where you can't be free, especially to speak? And we know the reason why the Founding Fathers put the First Amendment as the First Amendment, freedom of speech, is because it is so important to a liberal society. And while the UK's never had a free speech law, we've got one on the ASI website if you want to put it in as a backbench bill, John. It's ready to go. But we really cannot have a society wherein freedom of speech and those freedoms are neglected. I think it is absolutely obscene. And just on one last point to do with the blob and quangocracy. The people who come up with these nanny state rules all abide by them fully. They think it's completely normal. A friend of mine went surreptitiously to an ASH conference, Action on Smoking Health conference out in Slovenia. They finished the conference about 6 p.m. and they were there to really get some gossip and to see, what, they're all going to slip up, they'll all be drinking and, maybe smoking, doing some drugs, who knows. They were in the bar for 6 drinking Diet Coca-Cola, and then it was straight to bed for 7. These are the people that are ruling over our lives with these sort of regulations. And, I just think it's absolutely obscene. And I hope, the next government that comes in is just going to totally wipe the floor with these nanny state regulations, alcohol duties, tobacco duties, you name it. It all needs to go.
Let's all enjoy ourselves. Very much on the point that Andrew's made about general freedom.
Yeah, I just want to bring that specifically to the budget. And it is seen as a very easy way to raise a lot of revenue to freeze the tax thresholds. And this has obviously been done under the last government, and Rachel Reeves is threatening to do this for yet another 2 years. Now, when you're a young person and you're spending as much time, as Maxwell was saying, just paying your landlord, you're spending a lot more time than paying national insurance, income tax, 9% student loan. So these threshold freezes are devastating for working people. There just isn't a way to accumulate capital in the same way as there was before. And that is devastating for capitalism if you believe in it and its potential, if that avenue is being closed off. So we really need to increase the friction whenever thresholds are not frozen, not uprated with inflation. There needs to be a huge wave of anger and rage, and to make that not the easy option.
Yeah, very good. Any more from the audience? Yes, please go on. And then Bernard. I'm so sorry, Bernard. We'll go one, and then back to Bernard.
I'm happy to defer from Member of Parliament if you're happy to go first. Okay, thank you. Hi, sorry, that was really interesting. So I'm Joe. I run Elect AI, which is an AI skills training company. I've got about 1 million questions that have come out of this. I've been fascinated to hear from all the panellists. The one that I think has sort of come to me overall is, why is it? I mean, I've been following politics since I was about 10, 11 years old. And it seems to me that there's so many sort of interesting and sort of interesting theories that come up and propositions and things we should do. And then parliamentarians get into government and they seem to run up against a wall of something that basically means this never happens. I don't want to lose faith in the UK, but I mean, I have, because I've lived in Dubai and it was a disaster. And I can't have come back. But why does this happen? I mean, there's also parliamentarians here as well, but is it just a lack of determination? Is it that Margaret Thatcher was the only person who could actually force anything through the British state? What does this happen?
I'm going to turn to John in a moment because I can see that he's raring to go at this one. But I'll give you just one example from my own experience twice as a minister in 3 departments. Prime ministers actually more or less give up on leading ministers. I've never known a prime minister have a corporate-style town hall where they get all their ministers in, say, the atrium of the Foreign Office and say, you are the government. You are the government. This is what we're here to do. This is what I want you to go back to your departments and achieve. Instead, ministers allow officials to intermediate between them. I'm not blaming officials here. I'm blaming ministers. So you end up that, suppose Maxwell and I were ministers in 2 different departments, we end up having a bilateral where he and I are on opposite sides of the table with an army of civil servants, and we're all overbriefed. But I saw him in the tea room for lunch earlier, and ministers have got to get a grip. They've got to get a grip of what they're there to do, that they are the government and they should give instructions. And yes, treat civil servants with the utmost of respect, listen to them, they're there to advise, and that includes showing what the downsides of a course of action could be, but they're there to decide and take responsibility and work collegiately as a team with other ministers, and time and again they don't. John.
So, building on what Steve said, which I agree, the civil service have got the government completely stitched up. They're the ones who are running things, not the government. It's just a joke to believe that the government is in charge. And how do they do this? They do this through the Civil Service Code, the Ministerial Code, the Office of Ethics and Responsibility. I remember back in 2012 being told by a minister that the most feared person in the government was Sue Gray, who at the time was in charge of the Office of Ethics and Responsibility. Because if you said to your permanent secretary, I'm going to do this, they'd shake their head and say, I'm afraid at that point, Minister, I would have to report you for breach of the ministerial code. And you're seeing your career going down the tubes. And they were just terrified. Now, I believe that what has to happen is an absolute complete throwing up in the air and changing the way the civil service are run. The civil service currently create policy. They shouldn't. They should implement policy. They are there to execute what a government has been elected to do. The cabinet is a talking shop whose minutes and documents are prepared ahead of time that the minister just reads out. The cabinet should be the Prime Minister and Chief Executive with the managing directors of various businesses reporting and being told off. The Cabinet Office should be a huge project management office that says, here's the manifesto, this is what we promised to do, these are the things we have to do to make it happen, and every week we're going to look at whether you are on track, on your PERT chart or whatever, in doing all the things that you need to do in order to make this happen. And to do that, you have to get rid of the top couple of layers of the civil service and put political appointees in like they have in the United States. There's no other choice. Now, a permanent secretary can apply for one of those jobs if they think that they can report to the minister, but basically the Secretary of State of a department should be the chairman, the junior ministers below should be the chief executives of different parts, then they should have political appointees to be going around making damn sure that what they need to have happen is happening, and below that are the chief operating officers, the civil servants who make things happen. That's an enormous change, and unless you do that, will always be the same. The civil service, who are very fat and happy, thank you very much, with their defined benefit pensions and all that, and overpaid as well, they'll be in charge forever.
There's an interesting amount of theatre involved when a Prime Minister or a Secretary of State arrives in his or her department or governmental office. The first thing that usually happens after they're clapped into their private office, which is a very exciting thing as you walk in the Secretary of State, and it's designed to kind of hypnotise the new minister. The permanent secretary provides a briefing and basically tells the Secretary of State of all the departmental priorities. The moment this happens, your Secretary of State has gone native and everything is dead from then on. It needs to be the other way around, but it's so rarely is. This is particularly extreme when a new Prime Minister gets elected because they're clapped into their own home by the civil servants who are there. But the inference is that no, these are the permanent bureaucrats. These are the real masters of this building, and you're the live-in help for the time being, and you are taking instructions. Now, I think John's solutions are very interesting, and much of his diagnosis is true. But I also agree with Steve about just the lack of political courage and political vision. That the manifesto is whether you want to call it a compact or a contract or agreement or has some kind of moral and political weight with the voters. It melts into irrelevance when the lack of bandwidth and just the day-to-day management of Whitehall departments of thousands of people actually appears. And so few ministers have really got the sort of the political clarity and clout to say, no, this is what I was elected to do and this is what we're going to do. And then finally on legislation, which I think is really important to look at, there are three very pernicious pieces of laws which we like to call the Prosperity Institute framework laws, which erode so much policy-making, thinking, and decision-making. It's the Human Rights Act, the Climate Change Act, and the Equality Act. Combined with things like the Civil Service Code, where civil servants are not allowed to propose ideas which might be illegal for ministers to decide, even though ministers' jobs is changing the law, it means that if they propose ideas which might be out with the jurisdiction of the Climate Change Act, Equality Act, or Human Rights Act, you already have narrowed the Overton window of what a civil servant can advise a minister to do. So a minister might ask for a request for a piece of policy work. The response is, no, Minister, that's actually illegal. So the idea that ministers get to change the law is irrelevant, and then you've narrowed the Overton window of what can be done so quickly, and therefore you've narrowed what is the legitimate business of politics, and this is why voters are so angry.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Well, thank you very much. And I agree with so much of what has just been said about the civil service, and particularly about the leadership, because the politicians are responsible for the civil service we've got today. And the politicians need to decide on a Herculean act of leadership with supporters from within the civil service to change the civil service. And there are signs that even the civil service realizes it's incapable of doing its job. I sat in a meeting, I chaired a round table where there were no fewer than 3 former cabinet secretaries involved, and they all agreed they wanted to scrap the HR role in Whitehall. They all agreed there should be far fewer civil servants, they should be properly performance managed, and they should be properly rewarded for the jobs that they do. Instead, civil servants get recognition and award for doing all the wrong things, having the wrong attitudes and the wrong behaviours. So what we want is a massive culture change. Whether we finish up appointing all the senior civil servants, I think, is another matter. And I took my committee to the United States when I was chairing the Public Administration Committee. And we looked at this. And I can tell you, every American we spoke to, what do you want? Our system? Are you crazy? Do you realize how long it takes the president to make all these appointments? And I think there's maybe a quicker way of resolving that. But related to that, and it's about the responsibility of politicians, is the question I really wanted to raise, which is picking up what Robert said right at the beginning. He said politicians have been unable to be honest. Politicians have chosen not to be honest. Politicians chose not to tell the truth. And it goes back to the whole Blair-Mandelson idiom of doing politics, where you read back to the electors what your opinion polling and focus groups have told you that they want to hear, and you get elected that way.
Hopeless, yeah.
And the Conservative Party fell into the same trap, and it's why the 2 main parties are now hopelessly discredited, and why I think the one mantra that Kemi must stick to if there is to be any hope of a Conservative recovery is, out of her own words, it's time to tell the truth. And I think the Conservative Party is now telling the truth much more openly, but I do urge everyone in the Shadow Cabinet, in response to this budget, for goodness sake, tell the truth, that we've been living beyond our means for a generation or more. I wonder whether ever since Nigel Lawson said trade deficits don't matter, and we basically borrowed to consume from that day onwards, certainly through the Blair era and since. And it's been a disaster, and we've got to tell the truth. But why did our political culture become so sick where none of the leading politicians told the truth? Why did that happen?
Does anybody wish to respond to Bernard? This could be a long afternoon. I'm very conscious of the time. We're going to need to wrap up in a response to Bernard, and then I shall close.
It comes on from, I think, the decision to raise corporation tax, just as an example, which is that having spoken to people who were in the room making that decision, they brought up an internal focus group and said, here, Prime Minister, here's all the taxes that we can raise. We've asked the public. You can either raise it on yourself, or you can raise it on business. What's the good option there? And obviously the Prime Minister isn't going to go, we'll put another couple of pence on basic rate or whatever else. That'll annoy the voters. It takes a very brave Prime Minister to turn around to the focus group and go, sorry, we're going to need to do that in national interest. So I think it is just a matter of courage, as Steve was saying, fundamentally, is that I think we're too scared of our own shadows, fundamentally. And I look forward to the budget response a month from now, where we stand, where hopefully, Mel or Kemi stand up and go, look, we were at fault as much as you guys are at fault, but here's the plan to fix it, and we hope you can. And that will be a very refreshing thing, and I don't actually expect Reform to do that either, because some of their spending plans are a bit...
Right, we are out of time, so it falls to me to close this gathering. I want to say a word about why we're here. When I lost my seat, one of my supporters said to me, Steve, you should have a free market think tank. And I thought, sounds like he's offering to fund it, but I'll have a think about it. I went back to him, I said, we do not need another free market think tank. What we need to do is make the absolute most of the brilliant free market think tanks we've already got. So we set up Fighting for a Free Future to do what I think I've been doing for 14 years in Parliament, which is actually fight for freedom. And I mean in the roundest sense, actually. I think it's the money that catches up with us, but I think your point, Maxwell, about there are some more fundamental issues even before then, it's very well made. And young people especially have had a very raw deal. And I think the future for the centre-right is as a libertarian movement now for young people. People want their freedom. They know that government's failing. And I think we've all heard that across a very wide spectrum, it is the state that's failing. Rob set out the sheer scale of the spending. It's the state that's spending that money. Maxwell's set out the scale of the failure in planning and land use.
John's brilliant book is an entire handbook on how to deal with the problem of the state being too large. The Prosperity Institute's got the same message. It's state failure that's driving us down. The Taxpayers Alliance is all about standing up for taxpayers against the state. And again, the Global Warming Policy Foundation and your sister organisation, Network Zero Watch, are very clear why energy's failing. It's because of the state. We absolutely must land the message with the public that whatever our troubles may be today, they are not because of a free society. They are because taxes are too high, spending's too high, regulation is too wide-ranging and mighty. It's Lilliputian, somebody said. Was that? Yeah, Lilliputian, tied down. The society is too tied down. Does anyone think that we've been running surpluses too often? Does anyone think that interest rates have been too high with too little QE? The truth is, all of the problems that we have can be traced back to state failure, and that's what this project is about. It's about serving the think tanks and serving all of you to magnify the think tanks. We're going to try and get some really strong, powerful voices, maybe some former MPs, some influencers, and really get behind and boost the messages that all these think tanks have. So we have the Substack, we've got the podcast, we've got a community, we've got educational initiatives, and we have got these events. So I want to say a really huge thank you to, again, as Harry did, to our donors, a huge thank you to all of those who have spoken, and a huge thank you to everybody who's been here. On a lighter note, I want to finish with one thought. Where's Liam gone? Liam, let's have a look at you with your hat. Liam's hat has, its taxation is theft, but stamped across our logo there is worse than. I want to tell you, when people say to me, taxation is theft, I always want to say, no, it's not. It is much worse than theft. It's worse for 3 reasons. Number 1, the government allows you to protect yourself against theft. Number 2, when someone steals from you, the government pretends it's on your side and will do something about it. And number 3, thieves don't steal from you all day, every time you earn something and every time you spend something. So make no mistake, taxation is worse than theft, although also make no mistake, we are stuck with it. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for coming. Please join me in giving a heartfelt thank you to all of our speakers today for taking the time to come and fight for a free future.